Good afternoon or early evening. I'll speak Slovak. I want to welcome you all to this discussion. First of all, let me thank the organizers of the Central European Forum for having invited Anna and for having included this film and her appearance into the program. This is very important. I would like to welcome Anna Neistat, who has told me that this is her second visit to Slovakia. Before we start our discussion, Anna, let me mention something that you may not know. But when at the time I had a discussion concerning Kosovo with Dr. Černogursky, the former Prime Minister and former Justice Minister of Slovakia, because Kosovo is also part of my story. He said that there was no genocide in Kosovo, referring to the reports of your organization, Human Rights Watch. But the reports that preceded 1 year, that preceded the war by 1 year, they used the expression brutal ethnic violence, stating that 250,000 of ethnic Albanians 6 months or some time prior to the war fled before Serbian paramilitary and military units. During my discussion, I mentioned these facts, and our ex-Prime Minister responded, yes, but there was not a genocide. The reason I mention this now is that in Slovakia we have a very strong pro-Serbian and anti-Albanian public opinion. Kosovo is still a story which is very much alive. It will soon be the 10th anniversary of its declaration of independence, and the places shown in the film are familiar, very much familiar to me as well. Anna, I have the first question to you. What is your motivation? Why do you pay attention to this testimony, not only concerning Kosovo, but also concerning other war conflicts?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be part of the Central European Forum and to have a chance to talk to you tonight, this afternoon. In terms of motivation, I think I do have a particularly strong sense of justice, and that is probably related to my background, of which you heard a little bit in the film. I am Russian. I did grow up in a very special place in a very special time, and I did see both all of the injustice and repression that were part of the Soviet system, but also saw how the system eventually crumbled and collapsed in front of our eyes. And I think that gave me very early on in life a very strong sense that change is possible. And I do think that I carry this understanding, this hope, this belief with me pretty much everywhere I go, just regardless of how desperate the situations might be. But also, I just think that it's, I'm just trying not to sound too melodramatic, but in all of those places, once you see people who are just stuck there, civilians between the warring parties or activists, people who are trying to help, it's impossible to quit. It's not the job that you can quit after you have seen them, not necessarily the horrible things that are happening to them, but after you have seen all of them. You cannot just go away and forget, and then you know that you will see similar things in the next crisis.
I ask this also because the end of the movie shows a very intimate story when you and Ola had a child. And in the hospital, when you were in the hospital, you were still reporting some statements or opinions on the conflicts. To what extent are you able to separate your private life from your professional life?
Yeah, I don't think I try to separate them, and especially now after this one, we had 2 more children, so we now have 3 young children at home. Ule and Daniel has grown up a little bit and is off to university, but of course, first of all, it's just inevitable. With 3 young children, there is no choice. We have to be parents, not only human rights investigators. I do think that, do I ever stop thinking about work? To a certain extent, I try at least. But I do try to create kind of a safe and normal environment for my children, in a sense that I try to come back from all of these places in one piece, physically and emotionally, as much as I can, because I believe that they deserve a mother who is more or less sane and can engage in kind of day-to-day activities. But most importantly, I think both of us travel a lot, but we try to absolutely make most of the times that we do have together and the times that we do have with children. We have to plan this time probably more carefully than the families that do have the luxury of being together all the time. But overall, I think it's going surprisingly normal. It's difficult. It's a lot of logistics. It's a lot of late nights after kids go to bed because we try to spend the evenings with them and not working. But overall, I think it's actually very healthy to have both in your life. I just feel completely blessed to be able to switch from one to the other and back.
Ďakujem, no ja si myslím, že až tak
Thank you. I think that it's not a very normal thing. You can't get used to it. But I have another question on the issue. What is your answer when your relatives, your parents in Russia, for instance, or your children, maybe Ola, maybe others, are concerned about you and would try to convince you not to go to these dangerous places because it is obvious that it's very risky and that you might lose your health or life. So what is your response? Are you listening to them or you follow your own wish?
Probably says a lot about our crazy family, but I probably cannot recall a single time when either my parents or my children, or let alone Ule, have said anything along those lines. I guess my father, again, whom you now all know, is the most inconsistent one. Almost every time something is happening, especially when something is happening fairly close to Russia, like I remember very well, like the war in Georgia, for example, he would go like, he would watch TV and he would like, what is, do you guys see what's going on? Why is Human Rights Watch or Amnesty now? Why are you not there? Why are you not covering it? And then, of course, a day later when I would be packing to get on the plane, he would go into like, why do you have to go there? So that's usually how the conversations go. But I think my kids, my younger kids are too young to ask any questions along those lines. My parents, I think, understand very well what I do and support it every mile of the way. Ule obviously does the same thing. So with him, the conversations are much more practical. He would, we kind of do each other security checks before we go. And Daniel, my oldest, now went to university and wants to become a human rights activist, and now begging me to take him with me. So I guess just on a serious note, I think my family and my colleagues know very well that it does look dangerous when you cut it into a 90-minute film, and of course there are dangerous moments in our work, but overall we have put so much into security arrangements lately, and I'm sure it's it as well, Andrej, with journalists as well. It used to be that people just parachuted into these places without any equipment, without any preparation. This has changed, and especially in big organizations like Amnesty, like Human Rights Watch, there is so much preparation going on for all of these missions. So many parts of the missions might be cancelled if we cannot ensure our own security or security of our contacts or security of our information. So I do feel on most occasions we're fairly well prepared. Of course things could go wrong, but quite honestly things can go wrong pretty much anywhere.
Istota, príprava sa už časom.
Of course, the preparations have improved a lot in the meantime, but yet media and humanitarian organizations function in a way of having local people at the places of conflicts. They do not send people from Europe or from the US. They have their local people there. To what extent do you believe it is important for you to go to these countries in person to see the developments for your own eyes and to be exposed to a considerable risk? Wouldn't it be better to only use local people to work on behalf of your organization in those countries?
It's a very relevant question. I would say, first of all, that I think both for the media and for organizations like Amnesty International in particular, this border between local and international is becoming a little bit more blurred. Because, for example, at Amnesty International, we now have regional offices all over the world. Some people who work there are international, some people are local, so it's really a combination. So it's slightly different. They're all Amnesty staff, but they might be just as local. When I go to, I don't know, places in the former Soviet Union, am I local or am I international? It's a big question mark. We, of course, the key for us is that, and that is very important, whether it's me or an activist whom we trained, the question is that we need to be using a very precise methodology, because I think the stakes are now very high. They have always been high, but now, and partially, I think we're victims of our own success in some ways, because human rights organizations have become quite powerful, and governments do listen to us, international organizations do listen to us every once in a while. The perpetrators have become much more sophisticated and hiding their tracks and hiding their crimes. The whole area of fake news and fake propaganda has developed quite dramatically. So the burden on us to provide very specific, precise evidence obtained through a very rigorous methodology is huge. This pressure is huge, and that's something we put so much effort into training our researchers, how to collect information, how to interview. We're using more and more innovative methodology, which we haven't used before, such as satellite imagery, remote sensing, social media listening, sort of all of these tools, not just for the sake of doing something cool, but because it helps us to corroborate what we gather from witnesses and victims. And if you're looking into this field generally, it has become much more professionalized. And that's why it is important for us to be on the ground. And by us, I mean not just, internationals, but somebody who is trained in doing this, not just relying on a citizen journalist who provides you with a piece of information.
Napriek tejto vyspelej metodológii, ktorú nepochybne máte a ju používate,
in spite of the methodology that you evidently have and do use, could you tell a story when, in spite of all your efforts, you made a mistake and perhaps you proceeded on the basis of incorrect testimony or incorrect data and you had to correct your reports?
I'll give you an example where we almost proceeded. So I'm very glad we didn't in the end, but it was literally almost as the report, we could have proceeded and it would have been disastrous. But I think it's a very good illustration of this point. So we were investigating, actually as part of this, of our Syria investigation, this report that, I guess I was presenting in Russia perhaps or somewhere, when we were trying to identify Syrian generals, officials responsible for orders that led to commission of war crimes. So, and other violations. And so what we did, we were interviewing military defectors. We were extremely lucky. We landed in Jordan. There was a whole kind of refugee camp where everybody was a military defector. So we conducted lots of interviews, very useful interviews. And then there was this one person whom I interviewed for, I don't know, it went on and on for hours, maybe 4 hours. And I went, it was, I've conducted thousands of these interviews, so I definitely felt that, I was asking the questions back and forth because what he was saying was, almost too good to be true. He had all of the information. He claimed to be one of the bodyguards, kind of close security of one of the high-level officials. He described the meetings that he was present at, and I literally went into the kind of details that you normally don't go into, like how many windows were in this room, how did people sit around the table, can you draw me who sat where? Because the information was so, and what he was saying was so explosive. So I went on, and by the end of these 4 hours, I was actually satisfied that he was telling the truth. So we put it in the report in several places, and he referred to high-level individuals, including Bashar al-Assad and some of his close supporters. It went in the report in several places. We had his testimony, and literally at the last moment, all three of us, Ule, myself, and another person who was working with us on the report, we just had this gut feeling that we'd better check it one more time. So what we did, we called back in the camp and found some other person there, another defector whom we knew well, and he was kind of higher up. And we asked him about this guy, which we normally don't do. We don't ask witnesses about each other. And basically he said that this guy is a complete fake. That not only he was not, everything he said was not true, but he wasn't even what he was saying he was. And we took out, all of this testimony from the report, but it was literally at the last moment. And I can't even tell you what it was that made us hesitate at the last moment, but that's the danger, right? That's the danger of relying on people's testimony. However, so these things do happen, and we were able to prevent it at this point, but there were some situations where we had to publish corrections, where we did get something wrong. I mean, our reports are subjected to so many stages of editing, and everybody's very frustrated about it. They go through like at least 4, mostly 5 stages of editing. So 5 pairs of eyes, our legal, our lawyers, supervisors, people who are specialists, everybody looks in the report. So it's very likely that there is something there that doesn't sound quite right, that it will be caught somewhere in the process. But of course, sometimes it doesn't.
Veľmi smutný príbeh na tom celom je samozrejme Sýria.
The very sad story there is Syria, of course. When I was at Aleppo 2016, Turkish-Syrian border, Turkish province of Hatay, 1.5 million inhabitants, every 5th of this 1.5 million were 300,000 were refugees from Syria. And me and a colleague have taken their cases, which were horrifying. Assad regimes killed already some 250,000 people, and Daesh a tenth of that number. Why do I mention this? Recently, Raqqa has been conquered, so to say, the capital of IS. And today, we are not talking anymore about what a terrible criminal Bashir Assad is. That is not what we are saying today or hearing today. 7 years ago, Arab Spring started in Syria, and the same in the Arab world. And in Syria, we have the same president still, and the international community had to accept it. What is your view on that?
What can I say? I think, I share your frustration and anger about that. I'm absolutely convinced that Assad's place is in The Hague and not around the negotiations table. I guess the immediate reality of it that as soon as Russia entered the conflict in a much more open way, it became obvious that this is probably where it's going to go. The moment ISIS started gaining grounds in Syria, And in that sense, I hope this film will become more and more of a historical document of the fact that it was not there from the beginning of the conflict. I think it's very important to remember that the presence of ISIS, or that the responsibility for ISIS presence in Syria is equally shared with Assad, Western powers, and Russia, quite honestly. But with all of these factors in place, I think what we will see some form of peace agreement that at this point will keep Assad in power. I think that it's going to be short-lived, no matter what it is, because the division in the society is so deep. And even with ISIS out of the picture, and it will be out of the picture, you cannot just go back to what it was before the war. What I guess gives me some hope is again watching this episode in the film, which is definitely one of my favorites, where my colleague Fred is testifying against Milosevic. I think it's important that when my colleagues started doing this work in former Yugoslavia, nobody in their wildest dreams could imagine that one day Milosevic would stand trial. He was just as bold and just as confident that he would win as Bashar Assad is now. And look, it did happen. So quite honestly, I think sooner or later, both him and his generals will answer for their crimes. Whether it will be 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line, I of course don't know, but that's partially why we continue to document violations that are happening to this day, because all of that will become part of a very important record when hopefully it comes to prosecution.
Milosevic, you have mentioned, was issued to The Hague by Zoran Djindjic, who was then shot dead in Belgrade, and Milosevic died in The Hague. So his case hasn't been concluded. What would it be for you in case of former Yugoslavia? I mean, for you personally, what would be the evidence of justice being put in place again? And can you do justice in such a situation where you have thousands, 10,000s of victims, where the politicians deny their responsibility by saying that they never issued an order orally or in a written form that someone is to be murdered or killed? The same goes for Karadzic, who was recently in Den Haag. So can you have justice in such cases, and if, how?
I mean, I think the fact that Milosevic died before his verdict was issued is unfortunate in some ways. It would have been much better to see this trial go to the end, but at the same time, I think the proceedings themselves were extremely significant and extremely symbolic, including for the victims. I do think that people understand, and I've seen it, and I'm sure you have seen it too, in the most desperate circumstances, having lost their loved ones, having lost their livelihoods, people still understand the concept of justice. They do not just need food and shelter. They do look for justice, and I think when it's happening, I think everybody understands that it may or may not come to the verdict. It takes a long time, but it is there. We now have International Criminal Court. It's a very, there are lots of criticism around this institution, which we all know about. But nonetheless, I think, again, the symbolism of this institution is enormous. The fact that even heads of state know that at least theoretically, they can be brought to justice. This concept was just not there before ICC came into being with the ad hoc tribunals. But we also do have cases like Hisan Habre. We do have cases of former heads of state actually being brought to justice. They're very few and far between, but they do happen. And, I religiously tweet every time another Rwandan general or military commander is convicted, which does happen to this day. The tribunal continues its work, and now there are many other forms, right? There are hybrid tribunals, there are other forms. In many cases, it's just national mechanisms. After the government changes, the national mechanisms come into play. I'm very much hoping that the Sri Lanka investigation, for example, will lead to some national mechanism of justice. So it's never perfect. It takes a long time. But I do think that it is, every time it happens, it's very important to talk about it, because it gives hope and desire to leave to all the people who suffered these horrendous atrocities.
Ako sa dá vyrovnať s tým, že
how can you cope with the fact that the international community, the media, and other organizations pay, so to say, selective attention to various places and conflicts at the same time? When we go back to the early 1990s, we had a Bosnia war in 1995. At the same time, there was a Rwanda genocide in Africa. We know that it had 100,000 victims in Bosnia, because in Sarajevo there is a person whom I know and who studies the number of victims from all religious and other groups. But the Rwanda genocide caused more than 1 million victims, yet more attention was paid to Bosnia than to Rwanda. Why do you believe there is such a selective or different attention given by the international community to various conflicts? Is Africa less important for us than what's going on here in Europe?
Honestly speaking, I find it natural that people care more about what's happening close to their borders or about countries. France, where I live now, is very typical in that sense. France does care about Africa, but only about Francophone Africa, because there are closer historical connections. So in some ways, it's understandable. And, it's, I think, the glaring example of how the second there is a terrorist attack somewhere in Europe, we all change our Facebook profiles into the French or British flag. The moment there is a terrorist attack in Somalia, which kills sometimes 10 times more people, we barely notice. But I think, again, I don't attempt to change human nature. I'm trying to change, how the world and specific countries deal with those issues. What I can tell you is that at Amnesty, for example, of course, it's also the question of our limitations. We can't be everywhere, but we do intentionally try to look beyond the headlines, to really look into forgotten conflicts. This year we did another investigation in Darfur, which was completely away from the headlines. My colleagues just published a report on Marawi in the Philippines. Again, a fairly violent situation with lots of victims that pretty much nobody was talking about. So we try to do our best to bring these so-called forgotten conflicts back to the front pages, because I feel we have the ability and that's responsibility to do that. Whether we can make more people care about those places is a slightly different issue, but at least we can bring them to the front pages and to the attention of the policymakers who can make things better, even aside from making everybody caring about those.
Keď už o tom hovoríme,
Speaking about it, you are representing here organizations that document human rights violation. I am a journalist producing visual and audio images of war zones. How do you see the work of us, the journalists in the war zones? Perhaps we are doing similar things, but sometimes maybe our activities may be in conflict journalists do not have a feeling that the media simplify the situation. Maybe they only give a short shot on TV from the war zone, and the viewers are not able to form a comprehensive view of the situation based on such a short spot. Do you believe media are superficial?
You will never get me complain about journalists. I'm a former journalist myself. That's where my career started. I work with journalists almost every day in many of these places, and I have enormous respect for what they do, because in many cases, speaking of risks, journalists are subjecting, especially the ones who are trying to get imagery, are subjecting themselves to much greater risks than we ever do. I can easily stay outside of Aleppo for days on end interviewing people. For a TV journalist who needs to file that evening, this is not an option. So I do think in terms of risks, but also I think the journalists are becoming more and more many journalists are becoming closer to human rights defenders, and they are launching long-term investigations, very detailed ones with very specific recommendations, as you like. So I think at the same time as human rights organizations like ours are becoming closer to journalists with our emergency approach, where we are filing from the front lines. So I think there is a definite complementarity. For me, there are two scenarios, basically, in which our relationship with journalists enroll. One is a place where everybody has access. Absolutely every media outlet is there, and we are there as well. And I always feel that this is the circumstances in which there is absolutely no point in us competing with journalists, partially because we never have the same resources, especially compared to big channels or outlets. But I feel that our job is to maintain relationships, to talk to the journalists, and make sure that the angle that we're looking at makes it into the story. Right, so we would not compete in generating the news piece, but we would try to talk to the journalists, build the trust, and give them a little bit more than what you can just see, right? To some explanation of what it means from the legal perspective, some insight into how this situation can be analyzed from the human rights perspective. And surprisingly, many journalists like this analysis and do take it. And there are other situations where, for whatever reasons, we are the only people on the ground, where we have to become journalists. And I've been in these situations many times, like during the war in Georgia. All of the journalists were in Georgia. No foreign journalists could enter South Ossetia. So while there was a lot of reporting coming from Georgia, there was almost nothing from South Ossetia. So I was on the phone with journalists, giving them information that normally we don't give because it had no human rights value or no human rights meaning, but it was very important, and I was very happy to provide it because I understand that the journalists wanted to have both sides of the story. So I think there is, we work very closely, and we depend on journalists. Our work would become very, very difficult if it weren't for the journalists actually working with us to publicize it.
Keď som vás videl vo filme, ako...
When I saw you in the movie with this black niqab when going to Syria. When I watched you in the movie and I saw you in the black niqab when preparing for the trip to Syria, so I remembered the French or Canadian movie which was called Kandahar, about a woman who went to look for her sister in Afghanistan during the Taliban regime, and she dressed in burqa. Have you seen this movie, Kandahar? Excellent movie. And the camera was also shooting through a burqa. So what you saw was what you see when you have a burqa on. And I remember this because when I traveled Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I am a man, but I was dressed in shalwar kameez, in the local men's dress, and I was still very distinctive. People saw that I'm not an Afghani. And when you were dressed, Anna, in niqab, and you moved in Syria, have you ever thought that if some armed people would start talking to you, they would find out that you're a foreigner? they would find out very easily that, and you could become a case for a ransom, and they could kidnap you, or maybe they could hurt you.
There are several different answers to that. First of all, in many of these places, it is very rare that I operate alone. Right there, you know, we were working, as you could see in the film as well. We had local activists helping us. So a situation where I'm walking alone on the street in a burqa would be very, very strange. Second of all, this was not the case where I was trying so much to hide my identity from the people that we're interacting with. At that point, you know, the radical groups were not particularly active in those areas, so that was mainly just not to attract attention, mainly from the government, right? Especially because we didn't know the government troops were moving closer and closer, we didn't know when they would come there, so it was mainly to just not attract attention. I worked in some other situations, including in Afghanistan, where it was much more, and where I wore, you know, a full burqa, or in Yemen, where it was a little bit more difficult and a little bit more dangerous. Fortunately or unfortunately, I guess, the product of worldwide discrimination against women is an advantage in my work, because the chances that somebody would randomly start talking to you when you're a woman are very, very slim. I can barely, you know, it happened to me in Chechnya, for example, where again, you know, I worked dressed as a local, apparently looking very, very local. I don't know why, but I seem to blend in pretty much in any place around the world. And there were a couple of situations where people tried talking to me as I was crossing the border. And basically then you just pretend that you are mute and deaf, and that more or less works. So I cannot really recall a situation where I, I was working alone, didn't speak the local language, like Uzbekistan, you know, for example. Again, I was working, dressed a local, but, you know, the fact that I spoke Russian was sufficient. People wouldn't try speaking to me in the local language. So it doesn't happen very often. I just feel that you become invisible. You really, you know, once you have, a local dress on, and if you're a woman, unlike a man, even in a local dress, as you noticed yourself, you just become invisible. You know, I had so many situations where we would be crossing checkpoints in two cars, and my male colleagues would be stopped, no matter what they were wearing, and ask questions, and the car where I would be driving would be just waved through.
Keď už o tom hovoríte, keď som bol...
When you speak about it, when I was in Peshawar at Pakistani-Afghan border, my local friends gave me a different car every day. Was red, once white, green, and I mention it because I want to know what security measures do you and your company use when you travel, when you make these travels?
There are three sets of security measures that we're usually considering. One is our personal security, and that has to do with everything from your personal profile, right? Can we even send this person into this country because of their gender, because of their nationality, because of their passport, because of their ethnicity? If so, do they, again, what are they going to wear? What are they going to carry with them? Are they going to operate openly or not? Openly as Amnesty International or not, which we do very rarely, but sometimes we do. And of course, there's a whole set of security measures going. If you're not saying that you're Amnesty International, what does it mean for what you're carrying, for what the headquarters are going to do if you are stopped and questioned? So this is one. The second one is just physical security in terms of protective gear. We do have flak jackets and helmets. We wear them very rarely, partially because of the circumstances in which we work, and I'm sure you know as a journalist as well how difficult it is sometimes when you walk around in a flak jacket and there are kids playing football next to you. or your fixer doesn't have a flak jacket, or your driver doesn't have a flak jacket, and you probably cannot provide it for everybody. So with all the limitations, a lot of our security measures go into communications. So we have a very detailed check-in protocols, making sure, first of all, that we have means of communication. This has become much easier. I'm sure you've noticed in your world as well. I remember, when I was working in Chechnya, we didn't even have cell phones, or cell phones didn't work, and it was a completely different scenario. Now it is, we probably would, one of the reasons we would not go on a mission or to a part of the country is if we cannot establish secure communication. For example, if cell phones don't work and it's not an area where we can take a satellite phone, this would be a very significant no-go, especially if it's a significant chunk of time that we would be left without communication. Then there are a whole set of measures going into security of information. So we have, one person who is dealing with that specifically at Amnesty, and we go through very detailed arrangements on what's on our computers. Do we travel with clean laptops? Do we, what's on our phones? Do we use encryption? Do we use how? And sometimes, unfortunately, this is something that sometimes comes up mid-trip, right? And again, I'm sure you've been in those situations as well. Definitely happened to me multiple times where you kind of start and it's fairly fine. And then by the end of the trip, you have so much information in your notebooks, on your laptop, on your camera, and you know that the likelihood of you being searched on the way out is becoming very high. And then transferring all of this information, protecting it, is something that that you would do. But ideally, you would be prepared for that in advance, and that's why we put a lot of effort into that. And finally, it's really the measures that go into protecting the people who work with us, be it our witnesses or victims or fixers or drivers. And that, of course, is a whole different set of measures, including follow-up, making sure that after we leave, we still have reasonable means of communication, and quite honestly, in some cases, prepared to get them out of the country or get them to safety should they face any negative consequences for working with us.
Jedna stručná otázka, ktorú ste určite dostali.
I have a short question that you must have been asked. I myself have been asked this quite often. What was the most dangerous situation that you found yourself in?
The most dangerous situation. I mean, I guess in terms of kind of clear, imminent physical danger, Syria probably was the most dangerous one. We were closest there to bombardments, and so that was definitely dangerous. There were other situations that would not be obvious at all, like Haiti. I remember I was working in Port-au-Prince, and there was definitely more shooting there than I ever heard anywhere else. But in terms of the situation where I felt most unsafe, it was probably China. There was no danger of bombardments or armed conflict, but the danger of being picked up, and with everything that goes with that. I was working on the Uyghur riots in Xinjiang, and that was kind of very much undercover, with no means of communication pretty much, with no fixers, no drivers, all alone. And that is definitely a situation where I felt very relieved once I got on the plane that took me out.
In China, people doesn't speak English, of course. It's je pre vás to, že ste...
The fact that you are a woman and you travel to these conflict zones and into countries, Islamic countries, is it for you, let's say, an advantage, or is it a disadvantage, being a woman traveling there?
I always felt that it's an advantage. I can imagine that, I had some situations where I wouldn't say it was a disadvantage, but I was exposed to situations that men probably wouldn't have been, especially in my early years, including working in Chechnya, where suddenly our bodyguard, there was a very rare occasion when we used bodyguards, but when our bodyguard started negotiating with my male colleague about how much it would be to marry me. And he was dead serious. It wasn't even, he meant it in the best possible way. But I also realized that It was a reflection of, it was something to think about anyway. But in many cases, I think, as we were talking about, because you're invisible, because you're perceived as less threatening in many cases than any man would be, Western or non-Western, you do get to places where in many cases my male colleagues wouldn't be able to get. Another issue, of course, is that as a woman you can speak to women quite freely, something that, again, my male colleagues often cannot, and not only about sensitive issues such as sexual violence, but just generally. You cannot be left alone in a room with a woman in many of these countries if you're a man, which for me, of course, is never an issue. And finally, I think, I always say that some of my most satisfying moments come from talking to some, I don't know, Russian general or similar general who completely patronizes you and calls you babe and kind of undresses you with his eyes in the beginning of the conversation. But at the same time, he's a guy and he starts bragging. Oh my God, he starts bragging. And by the end of the conversation, there is nothing more satisfying than watching how his facial expression changes once he realizes that he has given you much more information than he ever intended to. So you have to, I guess, accept the negative consequences of that for the purpose, for the greater purpose.
Ešte jednu otázku a...
One more question, and then we would maybe start answering questions from the audience. But I have a question concerning the people who are important people of the Western world, that is diplomats, politicians, ministers, maybe also presidents. What influence do your activities have on these people? We've seen that your findings are very often used in arguments by world leaders in order to argue for something to be done or not to done. They use your organization's argument. So what is your influence on the decision-making of these leaders?
Well, I would say surprisingly, we do have this influence. I always, especially when we get very frustrated that we cannot influence a particular decision or when we feel that we're not being heard, I do remind myself of all the situations when we were able to change the opinion of policymakers without any tools of power. This is the fascinating fact, right? We do not have any means or tools of power. We don't have armies, we don't have lobbyists, we don't have media machine.
But you have information.
But we do have information. We have basically pen and paper, just like journalists do, and we do with just that. We manage to at times change their opinions. I would say the biggest. I can give many examples of that, but I think the biggest challenge right now is exactly that. It's really, first of all, that the balance of power has shifted so dramatically. The whole advocacy scene for us has shifted so dramatically. The governments that we used to rely on as allies, if you'd like, right? We are completely independent. We don't take any money from governments. We don't have any particular alliances. But, obviously, we had governments that we could go to when we needed support for a resolution calling for, referring Syria to the International Criminal Court. Or, we knew that if the American government is giving financial and military support to Nepalese army, we can go. We have access to the US government to lobby for them to stop or condition this aid and things like that. And now, of course, I feel that it is a completely different game. We are in the field where even those governments have sometimes turned 180 degrees, and we cannot rely on them anymore. So we need to be looking for both, and that's probably the biggest challenge on the table right now for us, is finding ways to, first of all, talk to the governments that we traditionally haven't spoken to, or at least haven't gotten a lot of leeway with, such as China or Russia or India or Brazil or South Africa. It's also finding new ways of talking to the governments that we used to talk before. So it's really, your last question basically points to one of our biggest challenges. We can still produce excellent information. The biggest challenge is turning this information into action.
Absolutely. Dobre, takže teraz...
Yes, we have some 10 minutes. Is there anyone who has a question? I see more people interested. This young lady here in the black, the lady in the black.
Thank you. So in terms of fake news, first of all, as I was saying, it's, fake news in and of itself is very difficult to address. It's just, I guess, for me, it's one extra factor that that puts more pressure on how we conduct our investigations. I think that the only way to deal with fake news is provide more and more accurate information, the information that is harder to dismiss, that is harder to challenge. Is it an ultimate solution? No, because fake news is all based on the idea that facts don't matter. But in that sense, I think that's the only thing we can do, and that's partially why we're trying to turn to more objective ways of information gathering, not just testimonies from victims and witnesses, which continues to be the core of our methodology. What I think has changed for us is operating in the new information space, right? We're very acutely aware that it is no longer sufficient to write a 150-page report and make sure that it's covered by New York Times, Guardian, and a few key outlets. We're really trying to catch up with the new trends in the information space, be it on social media, be it on media outlets such as Huffington Post or BuzzFeed or Daily Beast, something that we really haven't thought about just a few years ago. So I think we're trying to, at the very least, target the same audiences as the fake news are targeting. And that's a very important factor. It's not easy, and I wouldn't say we're very good yet at it, but that's definitely something that we're investing a lot of resources in. In terms of trolling, yes, we're being trolled all the time. In fact, we are now investing quite significant effort into documenting online abuse as a human rights violation, not just against us, but against, for example, female parliamentarians in the UK. That's really a big focus of our work. With prosecutions, we work both with national prosecutors and international prosecutions. It's very difficult for a human rights organization because of how we collect evidence and what is considered evidence. In fact, I just came back from testifying. It wasn't exactly a prosecution. It was not quite clear what it was. But I was testifying before a presidential commission of inquiry in Nigeria that was allegedly looking into war crimes committed by the military, in reality, a lot of this trial/inquiry was about Amnesty International and how we collect information. So we have to be very careful, but in many cases we do cooperate closely and provide information. There are huge limitations. We often cannot reveal our sources, and but it's huge if we really want to see accountability. That's one of the ways for us to establish it.
Ďakujem. Ešte boli...
Thank you. Are there any more questions here? Right?
Or perhaps is there a mic that you could use so that you can ask your question using the microphone?
Yeah, obviously. Do we need to translate into...
Ja len stručne vlastne tú otázku zopakujem po slovensky, že obvykle sú len dva spôsoby, že buď vlastne ignorovanie toho, alebo veľká vojenská intervencia, či je aj nejaký tretí spôsob intervencie v takýchto konfliktoch.
Yeah, I think there is third, fourth, fifth, and many other ways. For example, first of all, if you look at what's happening in Yemen, there is one thing, stopping the war, which is, in many cases very difficult and in some cases impossible. There is another thing, which is the humanitarian blockade, right? We know very well who's doing it. We know very well that Saudi Arabia, who is responsible for this humanitarian blockade, is causing hundreds of deaths from starvation in Yemen, and we know very well who the influences are. There is absolutely no point in invading Yemen right now. There is absolutely no point in invading Saudi Arabia, but there is a lot you can do in terms of diplomatic, economic, and other pressure. Sanctions, embargoes, visa bans. There are lots of tools, in fact, at the disposal of the international community that can be used and have been used in the past quite successfully to prevent at least the worst consequences of a given conflict. The bigger problem right now is the political will to use those means, and that's where I think all of our efforts go, is not just describing the range of means available, but trying to convince relevant governments that it is in their best interest to actually start using them before they run out of options.
Ďakujeme. Ešte je tam jedna otázka vzadu, nech sa páči. Skúste trošku hlasnejšie, ak sa dá. Ďakujem.
We are very sorry we can't translate because we got no sound. We have no mic.
How is changing the communication strategy of these organizations, not only because of the fake news, but due to a lot of the information in the current world?
Oh, it's an excellent question. I guess first and foremost, we're trying to be quicker. Right? It's really something that human rights organizations, unlike the media, had the luxury to not worry about. We could totally, publish a report about a conflict 5 months after the fact, still got significant traction. It just doesn't work that way anymore. When, for the first time, I remember my husband and I were working in Sri Lanka, we basically produced a report in 48 hours, and that was unthinkable for a human rights organization. Now it's something that we do quite often. That was a few years ago already. But we also, we look into much shorter bytes of information that we release. Again, it was really difficult to start doing blogs or dispatchers or short press releases or what we call media advisory, which is basically a press release, but that can be processed in terms of our internal processes much quicker. And the question there is that we're still trying to say something which is very similar to what we say in our reports. We don't just report on developing situation. We really try to put it into human rights context. And of course, the pressure is that the proof should still be there, the evidence should still be there, and of course it's much harder to do it in a 24-hour cycle than, you know, when you have all the time in the world. So, but we are moving into this much quicker cycle that hopefully in most cases corresponds with the media cycle. We also, for Amnesty in particular, we also trying to become a 24/7 type of an organization, right? We are no longer producing information only in London. We are everywhere from Mexico City to Hong Kong and everywhere in between, which allows us to actually be in the relevant time zone for different media outlets. And finally, we're looking into different ways of communicating, both in terms of the language that we use, but also in terms of the kinds of products that we do. For example, our head of communications now used to, or kind of the guy behind AJ Plus. I don't know if it's popular here, but AJ Plus are these very, very short clips that explain some of the most complex situations in a 1-minute video. So, and we are starting to do that more and more to try to really compress our information to a tweet. And that is not easy. Convincing a researcher that 5 months of research that he or she put into this investigation can be summarized in 140 characters, for me as a director of research, is not an easy matter.
Ďakujeme. Ak je ešte jedna otázka, tak by sme dali možno...
If there is one more question, then it would be the last question, please.
Čiže len veľmi stručne, tu sa...
Just a rapid translation of the question into English. Whether you have an optimistic vision for the future, that was basically the question.
I do. I guess I'm hopelessly and surprisingly optimistic. And I think it comes from, it is, I think, a direct result of my work, completely surprisingly, I guess, because I think what I bring from all of these places, what I bring from all of these war zones and war-torn countries is almost never the feeling of despair, because what you see, and I'm sure Andrej will agree with me, the level of resilience, the level of humanity, of compassion that people express and share with you in those type of situations is something that I carry with me everywhere. And it sometimes has very funny or kind of small expressions where suddenly in the middle of war zone in Syria people would cook this amazing meal and invite you, and they will not talk about war, they will not talk about deprivation, they will talk about some basic human values and things that they find precious. I have a whole collection of little souvenirs that people have given me in war zones, and they just, some of the most precious possessions that I have, a little ring that a girl in Syria gave me, a book that a guy in Nauru, in this offshore detention center that Australia runs, gave me. It was like the only book that he had in his room. They had absolutely nothing. And it is some, ridiculous, cheap novel. But he signed it because that was the only thing that he could give me, and he felt like he had to give me something. And and the fact that people in those places are trying to give me something, for me is just a reminder that that this is what will prevail, their faith, their hope, and their incredible resilience. There is absolutely nothing that even the most powerful, horrendous government, dictator, and military can do about that.
Ja ešte by som mal jednu...
I have one concluding final question. I was told we must end.
Oh, I'm so sorry. The car is waiting for you. Takže ja by som sa chcel...
So, I would like to thank very much Central European Forum for organizing this event. It was a very nice event. Thank you very much, Anna, for coming to Slovakia and to talk to us. Thank you so much. I wish you a lot of success, endurance, and luck.
Thank you very much.